The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
Welcome back, everybody. I am Jana McLean, Dr. Jana McLean, Faculty Liaison for the EL Collaborative, and I'm just so delighted to introduce this next group. We have today with us Holland White and Kathleen Sale. Holland and Kathleen have been working with the Translate Project, which is a research project funded with a $1 million grant from the Spencer Foundation. And over several years, Holland has worked with a team to develop a curriculum that really builds on the linguistic strengths of multilingual learners. And this past year, she's had the opportunity to do some coaching in Metro Nashville and Clarksville, Montgomery County schools with teachers, including Kathleen, who's been implementing this curriculum for the past year. So they're gonna share a little bit about the curriculum, but even more importantly than the curriculum, which all the resources are freely available, you'll hear about that after, but more importantly than the curriculum, just this general practice of how can we look for the linguistic assets of our students, kind of mirroring what we heard earlier about looking for the strengths from a trauma-informed perspective. How can we also look for the linguistic strengths of our students? So can't wait to hear all about what they have to share with us. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. I know it's getting to that point in the afternoon where everybody's going for more Coke Zero and snacks over there, I understand. So thanks for your attention. We have a little art project for you now, so maybe that will help keep us awake too. So we're gonna talk to you a little bit about the Translate Project curriculum, but we wanted to start off with doing an activity where we're also thinking about all of our linguistic assets and resources. Because I think sometimes a lot of teachers who go into that EL position tend to be maybe more monolingual native English speakers. And sometimes we think about ourselves as only having this one language resource, right? I only know English. This is the only language that I know. But I think when we think about it a little more expansively and we think about languages that we might be in the process of knowing, registers of language, dialects of language that we use in different spaces, we can see what our own language resources are and all the different spaces where we have to switch up our languages constantly. So everybody should have this language and identity cut out. And this is actually one of the activities that we do with our students in the curriculum, but I wanted to do that with you today too because I think it's really fun to recognize ourselves. And so I'll just model for you some of my language resources, and then I'm gonna give you a few minutes to think through what your language resources are. So first of all, I am a native English speaker. I would say that I mostly speak English on a regular basis, but there's one register of English that I have to use in my program at Vanderbilt, which I guess I'm gonna call Academies, right? That register of English that I would never speak in on a daily basis. That's not even really how I'm speaking now. But that register that I write in, where I say very fancy things, and sometimes I read back on the paragraphs that I've written, and I'm like, who is this person? Who said, like, I can't believe I said it like that, right? So this register of I put it in my head because it is not one that I would use and speak out with regularly. I'm going to put Spanish over here. I'm gonna draw ears on this guy, where ears are, because I am more of, I'm a receptive knower of Spanish, right? So my background is I taught high school English for several years in Austin, Texas. And some of my best friends were native Spanish speakers. Even though I was not specifically an EL teacher at my high school, most of my kids were multilingual students, and they were very fluent in Spanish and English. So I heard Spanish on a regular basis in my classroom, in the hallways, with my friends. And so I am great at like hearing and understanding Spanish, but it takes me a while to like parse through how I'm going to respond and say it back. So I guess I wouldn't say that I'm fluent in Spanish and English, but I would say I'm pretty receptive in Spanish. I also think that I miss hearing Spanish a lot. Like that's a part of those language resources that I feel like I don't get to flex very often as much at Vanderbilt, right? And thinking about specific registers of Spanish, like I know a lot of slang Spanish, right? Because that is what my students spoke. I know weird terms for things like, you know, the rubber bands that you put in your hair, like everybody called them ligas, and like that's what I would call them is, do you have a liga? I need to put it in my hair to put up a pony. But that's like a slang version of something there. What else? Oh, my friend would always complain all the time about a belly roll, and she would be like, my lonjas, oh God. So like those are the words that I'm familiar with. Those are part of my language resources in Spanish. I am from rural North Carolina, so I'm very familiar with Southern dialects. So I would say here, I'm gonna say North Carolina. So like some words that I'm familiar with in North Carolina that you don't hear other places. The word abate, okay, so what it means is enough. So my stepdad would always say, ugh, I'm so full, I had a bait of fish. And I would never heard anybody else say this, and it took me a while to understand what it meant, and then my mom started saying it too, and I was like, what is this word? This is ridiculous. But it is a word from rural North Carolina. The word Circe, have you ever heard that? It means surprise, like, I got a little Circe for you, like a little, like a flower or a little trinket or something. That's one of my language resources that if you said that word to me, I would know what that meant. I'm gonna put by my feet French and Italian. Now, this is not to say that I'm fluent in French or Italian. French is like the hardest language to me because why are there so many consonants that are not said out loud? Like I just don't understand. But when I traveled to France and Italy, I tried to learn some French. I tried to practice it with people. French people did not want to engage with me in that practice. That's okay. But I also tried to learn some Italian there. So these are just a few of my language resources. And I think if I didn't dig into them, I would think that like, yeah, I'm just a monolingual English speaker. I don't have any other resources. But as you can see, the more that I think about it, you can see I have a lot of language resources that also contribute to who I am as a person, as a teacher, as a collaborator with others. And so I want you to spend, let's say, 5 minutes thinking about your language resources and putting them on this cutout. I think some of you have already started. So 5 minutes, and then we're going to do a quick turn and talk so you can share about those resources. Go for it.
Southern dialect.
You're
a ball. Tennessee ball. You speak red deck.
I know I said 5 minutes, but it looks like a lot of people are finishing up and some people are already sharing. So why don't you turn to somebody near you and share all of your language resources. Tell somebody about those language assets that you have.
About the same.
Southern accent. Southern drop, yeah. Of course, Spanish was my first language, so I would consider that my heart. I am familiar with Southern speech and dialect, and I can actually turn it on if I really want to, and you have to.
And then I went to Luxembourg for years. I learned a bit of that language. And then I was in the Peace Corps after university, so I learned one of the languages in the Philippines. Then lived in Japan, so I learned Japanese, and now Spanish again because my wife's from Argentina. So
I think in Spanish I make a lot of connections to my English with what I know in Spanish, so that's why I
because I think body language is very important, to be open. Anyone can communicate with body language.
It's not in my head yet. And then I put on my feet, I put all the places I lived growing up because we moved all around with the military. And so I got lucky enough to experience a lot of different regional dialect growing up. That's part of the reason I like language so much is we literally moved from the Midwest to New England and then to Alaska and then to the South. And it was everyone talks so differently. So that was fun. Yeah.
Okay, let's come back together. I didn't know if anybody wanted to share a language resource or an asset that maybe they didn't realize that they had before. Yeah.
I added texting or memes, so you understand the LOL, the PTL, and all that stuff, and different things. And so then, of course, memes. I love memes. I like to share them with my kids. And so I feel like that's a language that you try to talk to other people, and they're like, what are you talking about? Oh, it's just a meme. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's a really great one. Yeah, meme language, text language, those are really great language resources, especially to have with students, to understand that. Any other realizations about your assets? Yeah.
I am a proud Pittsburgher, and for those of you who have never visited or lived there, Pittsburgh does have its own, I guess, dialect, you would say, called Pittsburghese. If you're not familiar, look up some of the terms because they are amazing. But my parents are both from Pittsburgh, so they'll be like, so-and-so was nebbing the other day. Nebbing means being nosy, and instead of clean up, we always said, I got to rid up the house. And I didn't realize not everyone in the world talked like that till I moved. So I would say things and people would be like, what on earth are you talking about? But it is, it's definitely a resource in terms of connecting with my family and where I'm from, and then it's always fun to teach people new phrases.
Yeah, I love that, thinking about those regionalisms. And I think, too, a lot of times our students start realizing, is because sometimes you'll just say, well, my class is they're all Spanish speakers. But there are so many different regionalisms and dialects within those languages. And once the kids start talking about it and they start comparing words, it's you can see the wheels turning, wait, you call it this? I call it this thing. So I think those regionalisms are really important to bring up with students, too. Yeah.
We were talking about the language that we get based on hobbies and communities we're a part of. Mm-hmm. So being a part of a religious community or a queer community or a hobby community, a certain sport or something, you have that jargon and that language. There's only specific people part of that community that it's almost like its own dialect.
Yeah, those community languages are really important for connecting too, yeah.
I'm going to put these all in the same group, but teen talk, movie quotes, and song lyrics. And because I'm elementary, or just because I'm weird, I still watch kid movies and stuff. So if the kids have to wash their hands, and then they'll come back and say, so-and-so didn't wash their hands. And I'll just say did you wash your hands? Did you, with soap? Did you dry them? And the kids will start chiming in with me because we've all seen Incredibles 2. And so even though they may not speak any English, but they've all have the Disney app and they've all seen Incredibles 2. So by the end of the time the person has not or has washed their hands, they're like, with soap? Did you dry them? And the person goes back and has to wash their hands. So we've got, I've just made everyone learn the movie quotes that we need to learn to survive. So
I love that, movie references that are on level with your students, and that's amazing, yeah.
So we have run into problems among our Spanish speakers because we have all Central America, Mexico, we have Venezuela and Colombia, that what is considered a bad word in one culture is just a word everybody uses in another culture. And so while some students may be offended, other kids are like, we don't understand why you're so offended. So there's that. I'm sure that goes in here somewhere, but yeah. We've struggled with that this year.
Yeah, and an interest, a necessary conversation to have too, right? Thinking about those regionalisms in language and making sure that, kids aren't offended by this word versus this word. So yeah, those are all really interesting things to think about when we think about our identity cutouts and our language resources. So we're going to shift over to thinking about your students' language resources. So we're here to, more specifically, like Jana was saying, we're talking about the Translate curriculum. So we're thinking about how to support students grow through their language resources. Sadly, Vanessa could not be with us today. She is sick, so I'll move on, and I'll play the part of Vanessa later. So you'll get to hear my voice even more, sorry. But we have Kathleen here. She's a teacher at Barker's Mill. You want to say anything else, Kathleen?
Just ESL teacher at Barker's Mill Elementary School, and I was privileged to teach with the Translate curriculum this past year and loved every moment of it. And
what grades do you teach?
So I teach K through 5. I used the curriculum with my 3rd through 5th graders this year, and it was wonderful. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with you and giving you a resource to ask questions as well as from the teacher's perspective. That's it.
And I feel lucky to have been able to work with Kathleen this year. And I'm Holland. Like Jana said earlier, I am finishing my PhD at Vanderbilt. This is hopefully my last year. And I work with teachers, and I look at supporting teachers of multilingual students. And so I've been working on this curriculum for the past 4 years. And it came out of this Translate protocol that my advisor and some other students devised, where we're using translating and using students' language resources to build their metalinguistic skills, which is what I'll talk about in just a little bit. But what we have done with that protocol is we work to create a curriculum around it. So basically, this curriculum is for teachers of students who are upper elementary to lower middle school. It is its own separate curriculum, right? So a lot of EL teachers have that extra time in the day where you're doing like pull-out time with students. That's kind of what this curriculum is for. So it is a year-long curriculum. You can see there's part 1 and part 2. With unit 1, we'll talk about the books in that, but that's also throughout the year looking at the experiences of refugees and immigrants and learning a lot about them. And so we'll talk a little bit about the overview of these lessons. So as you can see, there are a few components to this. So these lessons use students' entire linguistic repertoires, all the languages they bring to the classroom as a resource. It offers opportunities for voice choice and multiple interpretations and viewpoints. We think that choice is really important for all students, but especially our multilingual students who are oftentimes in schools not given very many choices. So we think that this is really important with some of the activities that we have in here, that they have the opportunity to choose what they want to do. It honors and builds on students' knowledge and experiences. It centers students' goals for language learning, and it offers opportunities for teachers even to learn languages, to foster multilingualism and observe patterns across languages as part of fostering multilingualism, and it gives teachers the chance to adopt a learner stance by learning from and with students. Sometimes it's scary to say that you don't know something, right? So it's easier to say, like, I don't know their language, like, let me kind of just ignore what they're saying. But I think when you admit that you don't know everything, it makes students feel more comfortable. When you ask them questions about their languages, you learn a lot. It gives them a chance to explain. And so this is built into this curriculum. And like I said, this is specifically for upper elementary or lower middle school, but I think that using some of these strategies that we'll talk about in a minute could also be applicable to other areas as well. So there are 4 core components that we're going to talk about: reading interactively, building background and fluency, diving into language, and then extending and applying learning. So first, we have this guided reading component. So basically, these are daily read alouds using grade level, conceptually rich, and culturally relevant anchor text to scaffold reading. So most of these texts are around a 4th grade reading level. When Stars Are Scattered, which is the book that we use in the first semester, it's a little bit higher, maybe 5th grade reading level, so I have a copy here as well. But it is a graphic novel, so that helps scaffold a lot with students' comprehension. And I Hate English is definitely more on a lower grade level, like first to second grade, but it's used more of a launching point, so you only take about a week to read it. And then you see the last book is Inside Out and Back Again, and it is all written in verse. So these are all texts that teachers read with their students, because sometimes they're more of a reach for students, and so having the teacher read it aloud helps guide them through the text. So what's important about interactively reading with your students? It gives them exposure to developmentally appropriate content and language, and it gives them assistance to access the content. So basically, we're always told, like, these kids must read they have to read on grade level. They have to hit this grade level point. But if you're just handing a kid a text and saying, here, read this, it's on a 4th grade reading level, and you are, maybe a recent arrival to this country, go for it. Like, that's not really helpful. So we think guided reading is really important for our multilingual students. The second component that we have in the curriculum, we have fluency passages. I know that sometimes fluency passages get a bad rap, and I think that this is because a lot of times fluency passages are completely disconnected from everything else. It's just like, here's a passage that you're gonna read about a red dog on a blue street, right? And kids read it, and the end. So the fluency passages in this curriculum are connected to the whole text that we're reading. So they're using the same concepts, they're digging deeper into those concepts, because really what we're also doing is we're building background about those concepts, because we want to make sure students know what's going on in books. So like, for example, Inside Out and Back Again is a novel about a young girl who ends up a refugee to the United States after, from the Vietnam War, right? So a 4th grader might not have a lot of background knowledge about the Vietnam War, or just about concepts around the Vietnam War. And so what we're trying to do with the fluency passages is not only give a chance to students to become more fluent, but also offer that background knowledge that they might need to understand the text. So you can see there's also, they're on a variety of levels. There's 4 different levels. And so the kids that are beginner readers have comic passages and sight word lists, and then it goes up from there. So thinking about why we need to build background in fluency, poor word reading can prevent skilled text comprehension. So fluency is something that you have to work on over time. And then also, like I said, readers need background knowledge to make this kind of meaning. And the third component is really the heart of the curriculum, where students are getting to use their language resources. So in the first unit, you can see where it says language deep dive in the middle. Students are diving into sentence parts. If you know stuff about Juicy Sentences work, this is kind of built around that concept. So they're thinking about parts of a sentence and figuring out how it all works together. And then in the second unit, students are doing translations of passages from English into a different language, into their home languages or other languages, and then back into English, digging into why they chose particular words in their languages and how that actually translates. So it ultimately builds those metalinguistic skills, so they're noticing similarities in words or structures of sentences, they're noticing differences in parts of words, even sometimes having arguments about what the right word is in a particular language. That's all a part of this component. And we'll give you some examples of that later. We think this component is really important because students already have language resources, like you already have language resources, that can support understanding and lead to metalinguistic insights about English, but we have to activate those resources because they're not necessarily activated when students are coming into a space where all they're hearing is English all day. So with this component, I wanted to talk about how translation really supports multilingual students' reading comprehension. So it leads to increased engagement with the text. When you are sitting down to look at a piece of text and then figuring out how to translate that, even if, let's say, you're translating that text into, we were talking about like text speak or meme speak, right? If you're translating that into a different language, you're really thinking about what all of those words mean and how they go together. And you're really engaged with that text a lot more. We also think that translation supports their comprehension because it builds on translanguaging skills that students already possess, but that aren't utilized in school settings. So when I talk about translanguaging skills, I'm talking about this movement among languages that multilingual students do on a regular basis, right? Like as they move through different spaces, they are moving among those language skills, and that's translanguaging skills that your students have. We also think that translation supports reading comprehension as it develops students' metalinguistic skills when they compare languages at the word, the sentence, and the idea levels. And then we also think it just supports a positive multilingual identity. When students are asked to use the resources that they have, when they're asked to use the languages that they use at home or even at school, but like in non-sanctioned spaces, that really builds that identity of like, oh, it's actually a really great thing that I am a multilingual person because these are resources that are helpful for in an academic space, right? Because a lot of times we kind of ask them to leave those things at the door. We don't ask them to bring them into the classroom. So the last component of the curriculum before we get into some teacher experiences with it is extending and applying learning. So these are basically extra activities that extend some of the reading comprehension. A lot of them are about vocabulary. They're also about imagining different scenarios. And so I think Kathleen is going to tell us more about that and her experiences with that. But we think that students need choice. So this is a space where students can choose which kinds of activities they want to do that day. And students need to apply what they're learning independently. So this is a space for them to figure things out on their own, or with a group. Some of them are group activities. I know that we have like a heads up vocab activity that some of the kids were all about. Like they wanted to play it with the whole group, just figuring out from basically like charades what the vocabulary words are. And these were really big words, like the word evacuate. And the kids were like, oh, I know what that one is, right? So we think these are also really cool activities included in the curriculum. So now we're going to hear from Vanessa, who is not here, but I will tell you about Vanessa's experiences. So these are some of the things that Vanessa talked about. She said that as she used the curriculum, she realized that her students loved translating and they felt a real sense of leadership. So Vanessa is a middle school EL teacher, and she works with 6th through 8th grade students. I was there a lot of times in her 6th grade classroom, and I noticed especially a few of the students really taking charge. Like they were like, Ms. Palladino, this is how you say things. This is the word that you're looking for. Write it like this. Can you spell that up on the board? Right? So they were even like telling her how to write it out, how to translate it. They felt this sense of ownership over the class where they were really engaged and they were really involved with what was going on. And she really enjoyed the curriculum because she talked to me a lot about not having access to very many novel studies. She felt like in her teaching in middle school, everything tended to be nonfiction, and that her students didn't really get a chance to engage with longer pieces of fiction, so she really appreciated having novel studies. She said that they were beneficial in building a foundation of comprehension that facilitated language acquisition. She learned that there was power in using their native language to learn a new one. So she, in her classroom, in that 6th grade classroom, had a range of, I think halfway through the year, a student came in from Argentina to students who I think were born in the US and like knew some English from day one. And so she had a huge range of Spanish and English skills in that classroom. So it was really great to see those students collaborating and teaching each other and learning from each other. And then she said that curriculum materials, they gave them the opportunities to connect personal experiences to their learning. And so the text that we chose for this, we wanted them to be culturally relevant to the students, if not necessarily like super culturally relevant, like a lot of the texts are about the refugee experience, then something that they could connect to. So here are a couple of pictures from her classroom. This is one of the diving into language lessons. So in this lesson, what the process is the students are working to look at a small passage and they're translating part of it. So you can see at the bottom where she's circled like and wet and crying, that bolded section is what the students were supposed to translate. And she is asking them in English first. Okay, let's break it down. What do these words mean? What's going on here? And they're answering the who, what, where, when, and why. And then in this next slide, this is where they worked together. So they worked in pairs and then shared out their translations. So what's interesting about her classroom is she has this translator going on the PowerPoints. I don't know if any of you use this. You can see it at the top that there's words in Spanish. So as they're talking, it's translating into Spanish for some of her students that are at the beginning levels of learning English. Well, you would think that then the students would just look at that and decide, like, okay, that's what the translator said was the right word. We'll just write it down in that. They had so many arguments with that translator. They were like, that is not the right word to translate that to. That's ridiculous. Why would you do that? So honestly, this the conversation around the translation for spill, and that's derrame here, that went on for the longest time of like, what is the right translation for spill in this context? Is it spilling a glass of water from the table? Is it spilling like the contents of your purse? Is it spilling your guts? Like what's the context of spill? It's gonna mean a different word in Spanish. I don't agree with you. So this was an argument, but it was a beautiful argument where all the students are engaged and asking each other like, well, I think what you mean is this. This is, well, actually, when in my home country, we say it like this. So it was also not just arguments over the word, but like talking about regionalisms and talking about what are the different contexts for using these words. And these are kids in 6th grade. So you can see how this brief exercise really brought to the forefront their knowledge. And it was not a conversation where Vanessa could step in and say like, actually, this is the right answer, because she didn't know. She's not fluent in Spanish. She's trusting her students that they're telling her what they think is the best answer here. And so it's not only building their metalinguistic knowledge, but I think there's also some trust being built in that interaction too. So you can see here was a quote that I pulled out from that class. So she's saying, what's the simile in one student's cluster of eyes? And she's like, what are they being compared to? What is she saying looks like eyes? And this other student, she's like, yo sé, black seeds. And everybody's like, oh, okay, here we go, right? So next we have Kathleen, and she's gonna talk, and I'll stop talking.
So some of the things that I loved about the curriculum is that students loved reading the interesting texts. If you look at the books that she showed, and I'm glad that you had them here, When Stars Are Scattered, it's one of my favorite books ever. It was a graphic novel. Again, it was appropriate for my students. I taught 3rd through 5th. My 3rd and 4th graders were together. That's why I chose to do that. My 3rd graders, mostly across the board, were higher students, language-wise, and so they handled it really well. And they loved the graphic novel. The content in there is like real world, real situations. It is based on a true story about refugees growing up in Dadaab, right? I gotta think back, that's been a while, it's been almost a year ago. And so, and they were from Somalia. They were from during the war, they fled, and so it's real situations. And so what was good about this is it talked about those real world situations which are relevant and engaging, but they were at a level that was appropriate even for 3rd and 4th and 5th graders. And so that's what I loved about it. It just touched on it enough, gave enough information for them to gain some knowledge, but not to be so maybe too realistic for them at that age. And so that's one of the things that I really liked about that. And then when we got into I hate English, I'm like, do I want to teach my kids I hate English? Wait, what are they thinking? So this came right after the first of the year. But I had 2 new students, and one was in 4th grade, and they'd come from Puerto Rico, and she had 0 English language, 0. And it was her. I had a 1st grade. She had a 1st grade sister, and she was in 4th grade, and she was a little rebellious. She didn't want to learn English. So this book was totally relevant for her at the time, because it's talking about a girl who knew some English and was learning English, was in her same situation, but didn't like English. She wanted her native language, and why should she learn English, and why is it relevant in her life? And through the book, she learns why it would be relevant. And so this was really good for my young lady who was in that same situation. So it was very relevant to her life in that moment. And that's what's so great about this curriculum. And then going back over with Inside Out and Back Again. So this is really relevant to me. My dad was in Vietnam when I was born. So I was almost 10 months old before he ever saw me. And so this was really relevant to me. I loved this, and seeing what what the people over there, were experiencing. But it's also tied in because when we're in the middle of this is when Russia invaded Ukraine. And so we could bring that and pull that real world understanding in and ask these kids, well, do we know anybody else who might be running from war torn? And they're like, oh, the people from Ukraine. And so they were able to pull that into it, and it was very, that made them more interested and engaged in that. So these were, even though they were really interesting and fun books, they were real world situations and very relevant for them. I had a student who came into my classroom. She was in 5th grade. She was brand new to my school. I live or work in a very transient area, right in front of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So we get new students all the time. And so this one girl, she came in literally, she was laying on her desk. When I would teach her, it was just the two of us. I would talk to her, and she would, she had no interest in learning, didn't care what I had to say. And I would just be like, okay, we're right here, come here, right here, right there, pulling her in. And as we started getting into this curriculum and reading the books, she really gained a lot of interest. And so even though she was a very low reader with the When Stars Were Scattered, or When Stars Are Scattered, it was very engaging, and it was with the graphic novel, she was asking every day, can we read? She wanted to read every single day in that safe environment where it was just myself and another student. And she wanted to read every single day. She, with the fluency reading, that was another thing. What we did, if we just talked about it, what is the importance of fluency? Is it to speed read? Is that why we do that? And we talk about that. That's one of the activities you do, is you write out and talked about what fluency is. It's it is not just about speed reading. It's using clarity and understanding, and at a pace that's not too fast and not too slow, so that people can understand you. And I talk to them about how important that is. And then of course, you take advantage of that, and you use examples, and you talk really, really fast so they can't understand you, and really slow, and you show them the relevance of what real fluency is. It's not speed reading like a lot of kids are taught, I think, when they're in lower elementary school. They're reading as fast as they can so they can build those words, and I got to do more words. And this curriculum supports and backs them off of that, and say, we want, reading that is well spoken, and your words are enunciated and people can understand you, and we really focus on that. But she loved seeing her progress. So they would do a pre-read, and then they would share, and they would read aloud to each other. So they would read it, then they would read it aloud to the other one, then get timed, and then the other one would read it aloud. So they're reading it again, and they would do that for 2 days each week. Same passage. And when they would see progress of even 4 and 5 and 6 or maybe 10 words from one day to the next through those 5 readings, she was like, so excited that she was increasing. And for someone who struggled with a love to learn and with reading, her whole experience, educational experience in front of my eyes changed, and it blossomed. And it was through the basis of this curriculum, and how in-depth it was, and how easy it was for them to grasp a hold of and stay engaged in. It was very well put together, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. And so that was one of my highlights, is this little girl. And then she asked me, fifth grade graduation, are you going to be there? Are you going to be there? Will you be here tonight? She really wanted me to meet her parents, and she's going off to middle school next year. And so hopefully through this curriculum in that class, she gained enough interest and love in learning that it'll go into her middle school years, and she won't be lost. I just, the thought of her getting lost, through the cracks just is, heartbreaking. And y'all, I know you all understand that. So I had another student who I literally would have to take the book away from him. So he was one I had, so when Stars Were Scattered, I had 3 brothers who came to me from Africa, I think in November, and we had just started this book, and I would have to take it away from him because we would read the passage, and all my kids would be like, what? That's it? That's all we're reading today? They wanted to continue. Every day they wanted to continue. They weren't like, oh, good, it's over. I don't want to read anything else if I have to read again, like happens a lot of times with the text that we're reading, but they were all like, no, we got to see what's happening. I'm like, not today. Put your books away. Put them in your desk. And with this one young man, I would have to go over and I'm like, give me your book. And I'd take his book and I put it up here. I said, tomorrow, you get to read the rest and we'll find out tomorrow. And he loved the book. He was that engaged all the time in trying to find out what's going on. So that same student that I was just talking about, straight from Africa. Now they have, they learned English in school. English is one of the languages that these 3 young men, really, I guess the 2 of them, the youngest one was in kindergarten, but they all had a working knowledge of English. It was just in a different, with a different dialect, so it was a little hard to understand, but he didn't want me to give him the answer. They were so engaged in learning and pulling the pieces of this curriculum, the content of these books and the activities apart, that they didn't want the answers. They wanted to figure it out. That's what was happening in this classroom as we were going through this curriculum, and because they had learned how to figure it out. So the activities that are in this and the lesson plans that are in this curriculum are just, they're extremely in depth, and I'm excited to use them again this year. Look forward to using them again. And so I want to talk a little bit about what was in the curriculum. And so the reading passages, first of all, as Holland had explained, and she is the author of many of them, so when she would come into my classroom, my kids were like, oh, she's famous. Oh, we're meeting someone famous. It was sweet. It was really sweet. But so they were very relevant to them. So they were relevant to their lives. It talked about students coming in in situations where they didn't know the language. Their first day at school, or coming in as a refugee, or different things that were relevant to these students' lives. So it wasn't just words on a page. They could relate to these. A lot of the curriculum, when we would do different passages, reading the books, I had students say, oh, that happened to my dad. Oh yeah, I remember what that was like. Have any of you ever gone into a classroom and, you didn't know anyone and didn't know any of the language? Have you ever experienced that? And they're like, yeah, that happened to me. Yeah, it was like that for me. And so that's what's happening with, what's happening with our students, with Ha, and, and with all the things they were talking about up here with our refugees and what happens with immigrants and in refugee camps. It's in this book. I kept going, oh my gosh, they're connecting to our books. So all of these things are relevant to these kids, and they've experienced them. A lot of them have come over for reasons that, aren't good, because their environment where they were are not good. And some of them have been residents of the United States. They were born here and don't know this, but others definitely have come in from situations that are not great situations. But in your curriculum, there are so many things. There is vocabulary for every week. You get new vocabulary, and the kids see the vocabulary. They have access to it, and that all of that's included in the reading passages and the fluency passages. So they learn that vocabulary through those and it's discussed in the fluency passages. And then you get like an overview, just a lesson outline is also in the curriculum. And so it's really easy to follow if you have to write your own lesson plans, or if you can just make copies, if that's something that you do. I rewrote mine, just added some things to it. It's got the standards, the state standards that are attached to it. And for me, with including my third graders, I just would follow down the line and include the third grade that was relevant for my lessons, for those lessons. There's questioning. Every day when you read the passage, there are questions that you ask the kids that get them to go back and look at the text and think about the text, where they'd really have to, analyze that and think about the words and what the meaning is and what the author is wanting you to get out of this. Am I running out of time? I'm sorry. I'm very passionate, obviously, about this curriculum. By the way, I don't get any money for so it changed my life as a teacher. It did. I love this curriculum. The language deep dive that she had shown a little excerpt of earlier, that was one of my favorite parts. It was one of the harder things for the kids. They have to summarize. You read a passage, and you get them to kind of think about and summarize. So one of the things I would tell my kids is, okay, so if we read this passage today and you wanted to go home and tell somebody about it, what would you say to them? How do you trying to teach them how to summarize, how to think about it in a simple form? And then you go in and you start dissecting the words. What is the author's purpose for using this word versus this word? And the kids were really diving in, and they are understanding it. Through this curriculum, my students, were pulling out dictionaries. They were using thesauruses. Some of the resources that I loved, the activities. We did what do you see, what do you think, and what do you, help me out. Wonder, thank you. What do you see, what do you think, and what do you wonder? And so every day you would look back, they'd look at a part of the book we had read before and say they really need to think about that and really analyze what's going on in that moment. A lot of times they'd be like, I wonder if they're going to get resettled in America. Okay, that's the big wonder, but what's the wonder for this moment, And really making them analyze that. They did a graffiti wall. That was one of the activities the kids love to do. They take a vocabulary word. How many of your kids want to write out vocabulary words? How many of your kids volunteer, can we do definitions today? Because that's what I did when I went to school. I'm a little bit older than probably most of you, but we wrote out vocabulary words, and it was not my favorite thing to do. But they wanted to do this because they did it as a graffiti wall, and so they wrote out the definition, and then they wrote out a translated synonym for it, and then they would write a sentence for it. They would draw a picture for it, and then we would put it on the wall. And so we had a graffiti wall, and I think you have a picture of Vanessa's, right? And so they loved to do that activity. Another thing we did was we would do a comic strip. So they would take an idea, and they would write the comic strip about whatever that sentence was, or whatever that thought or that idea was. And so they'd create their own. So they would get to draw a picture, and then they would have to write a little bit of a text that went along with that picture. So those are the kind of activities that kept them really engaged, that made them love to learn. So I had a new admin last year, and she gave me permission to use the curriculum. I just let her know that it was recommended by our EL director, and so she wanted to, when she did my observation, she said, I want to sit in on that, since we're not using district curriculum, we're using different curriculum, I want to sit in and see what's going on with that curriculum. And she came in and she sat down, and she was very impressed with the curriculum. She loved the texts. She loved the thoroughness of the activities and the engagement and the questioning and all the things that went in. And she left there feeling really good about her decision to allow me to use that curriculum that was recommended by our EL director in Montgomery County. And so even with not being familiar with it, she was very pleased after sitting in and seeing it, that decision had been made. And so it was good for me because she was in there observing. So I got my observation using fantastic curriculum and activities, and they made me look like a really good teacher. So when you have great resources, right, it makes teaching really easy, and I'm very grateful for them.
Vanessa wanted to offer a few takeaways. You can see this is the graffiti wall on the left. I don't know if you can really see it very well, but that was some of the stuff that her students did with the vocabulary words. So she really liked the embedded question guide, and the fluency passages and opportunities for discussion and translation, graffiti cards. They're paired PowerPoints for everything. And then she did a lot of technology, so she included that on her own, and I think that she did a brilliant job of that. And I wanted to say, I feel like as we're talking about this, it sounds like we're selling a product, but we really are not. We actually, at the end of our presentation, I'll give you a link. Actually, you can email me, and we have all of these materials for free if you just want to see them, if you want to use any of it, if you want to use any of the strategies that you notice in the curriculum. But we just feel really passionate about offering materials that are specifically for our multilingual students, because they just get overlooked so many times, and they're kind of an afterthought a lot of times. It's like, okay, well, you did this in your regular class, let me look at this again with you. Or, teachers are frazzled. I know a lot of elementary EL teachers have to figure out what to do with every single grade, and as a former high school teacher, I'm just always in awe of elementary teachers for all that you do. So I think it helps support, your multilingual students. And like I said, we're not trying to sell it, but we're just trying to offer resources if this is something that you're interested in. But your takeaways before we do some questions, Kathleen.
So my takeaways, what I liked is the text. Obviously, I talked about those a lot. When Stars Were Scattered is a wonderful book. I highly recommend you read it, and it is a true story. And then how easy it was to follow. Everything you need for lesson plans are in the teacher's guide, and all the resources. Also, each student gets their own book about this size that they have. That's theirs. Like I said, you can make copies if we want to make copies, if you need more, and all of it's there for them, and it's exciting. They like to have that ownership, have that book themselves. Then how in depth and engaging everything was. The kids were excited all the time to come in and learn. And my kids came in right after lunch, just so you know, my third and fourth graders, I got them directly after lunch, and they were still engaged. They enjoyed the lessons. They couldn't put down the books. They loved that there were different activities each day, that reading passages were engaging. And I just watched them, grow academically. It was wonderful seeing the growth and the excitement. A couple students in particular, but all of them. Even the general education teacher for that one student, she would literally was turning nothing in. She couldn't get her to complete a single assignment. And then by the second half of the year, she was asking me, "Can I do this? Finish this? On computer time? Can I please finish this assignment? Can I finish this assignment?" She was turning almost everything in. It was that big of a difference. Another teacher commented on how my student, who never said a word in class, never said a word, by the end of the year was collaborating with the students and communicating with the students, because we were doing that every day in a safe environment, which built up his confidence in order to do that in his general education class, and through those interactive activities. And so I needed more time. What would I change? I needed more time. Imagine that. I would have loved to have had another 30 minutes probably every day with my kids. And I would like to see this, if we could bring it down a little bit and get something similar to this for like my second graders and possibly even my first graders, with some of the texts and some of those activities. And because it was just, it made that big of a difference in my classroom.
Yeah, and I think I personally saw Kathleen grow a lot too. And even she just finished taking a Spanish course this summer because she promised her students after this year that she was going to learn Spanish, and really took a summer course of Spanish, and I'm sure did so well.
I passed.
Which is really awesome. So we're just gonna wrap up here. Here's contact information. So our website for where the materials are is translateproject.com. And it'll have a link, and it'll say you need a password. So if you want access, we just edited and revised some of these materials. You can email me and let me know. And I would love to give you access to whatever resources you would like. As far as like getting the actual materials, that's as like the books and stuff, that would kind of be on you, because we don't have endless amounts of money to to do that. We would love to partner with you. I think maybe as of this, because we're partnering again with some Clarksville and Nashville teachers, but I think we're maybe at our max for the teachers that we can partner with this year, just because we just can't buy enough books for all of the kids. But as far as, you know, the written materials, the PDFs are all, you know, for you to access however you want to use them. So, yeah.
I just have to say thank you for developing a curriculum that honors the first language of these students. I've been teaching a long time, probably longer than almost anybody here, and I haven't ever seen that. And that's exactly like when I finally discovered my translator app on my phone, my class came alive, and adding this to it is just going to make a world of difference. So thank you.
You guys are like right on time, like to the second, wrapping up just in time for Q&A. I have a couple of live stream questions. The first was, is the curriculum available to purchase? So just to clarify what Holland just said, the materials are available via PDF for free. You can download any material of the materials for free via PDF at this translateproject.com website.
If you first email me so I can give you a password.
Email Holland for the password. So
yes.
You can download any of the materials. There is the cost of printing, you know, they're workbooks, and so the PDFs are available for free, but the cost of printing is something that your school or district would have to assume. And also purchasing the texts that go with it. So, you know, purchasing When Stars Are Scattered for students, for example. There is a resource called firstbook.com if you're at a Title I school where you can get these texts for very low cost. So if that's something, if this is something you're interested in doing, there are some ways to do it cost effectively, much less than purchasing a packaged curriculum. So that was one live stream question. Do we have any questions from the audience here?
I want to email for the password. It's Holland LY or Holland IY?
Yes, sorry. It is holland.l.white. It is all undercase or lowercase, yeah. Yeah, not an I, it's an L. That's a Vanderbilt thing where you have to like put in your middle initial. Yeah.
Yes, Chris. I am the queen of questions. But so you're translating and you have all Spanish speaking students. How do you manage that translating part where you're like you had it translated on the slides when you have multiple languages in the same classroom?
So I had mostly Spanish speaking, but I had a few. My kiddo from Africa, and he really didn't really have a second language. His primary language was English. It was just a different dialect. And so he sat with his friends and he either translated in Spanish with them, but he also had French as a background. And so I just used word-to-word dictionary and he sat through, and sometimes he wanted to be with his friends and translate with them and learn a little bit of Spanish. And sometimes he wanted to use his French background and he would translate in French.
And I think that's an interesting thing where so in a middle school classroom, there was one classroom where it was Spanish, Hindi, there were Arabic, Somali. So there was a lot of different languages, and so usually, like sometimes there would be a partner, sometimes there would not, and so with the conversations there, it's a little more complicated, but it's more getting kids to like share with somebody else, to say like, this is what it is in my language. And sometimes with sharing those translations, we could, if they felt confident enough, they could come to the board and like show what the words looked like. That was always fun, especially when it comes to if some student knows like Arabic script, when they look at the script and compare it to like Spanish, just looking at the letters at the letter level, how it looks. It is tough when you have singletons like that.
So my follow-up question to that would be, what do you do when the students themselves don't have language literacy? Their first
as far as they don't
literacy.
know how to write it in, like they know the language, but they don't know how to write it down. So with that, a lot of times we ask them to approximate. Like if they know the sounds, we ask them to transliterate into what sounds they know in English, because that definitely happens a lot. Especially, I think it was with Hindi, she didn't know how to write it in that language, but she could kind of sound it out when she was saying it out loud. So that's one way of doing it too. And some students, they would just translate it to a different version of English, like how would you say this to your friend or your grandma? Because I think the thing is a lot of teachers don't realize that sometimes in those intake surveys when kids get classified, it says they might speak another language at home, but when it comes to reality, they don't really. And they're still in these classes and they mostly speak English. And so a lot of our teachers learned that this year. They were like, oh wait, this kid doesn't actually know another language. Like, I'm not sure that they should be in this class, which was an interesting realization. But also like thinking about what are other dialects or registers of English that you could translate this into.
Well, like in the first whole semester is learning to paraphrase and summarize. So if a student is not able to translate, they can learn to paraphrase or summarize. Something different. I do have one more on the live stream before, and then I'll get that question.
Can I add one more thing? Okay, so just real quick, when we were having a discussion and you were talking about your kiddos with the text talk and the memes, I thought that would be a fun activity to add into that. If you have students like that, is to use like a text talk or a meme or just some way that they can participate where they wouldn't be able to if they don't have that, and just give them a way to be engaged in that activity and then still learn from their other kids.
There is a study, I do not have the citation off the top of my head, but one in which a group of middle school students was asked to change an audience. So there was a science class and they were asked to explain the science concept for a third grader. And that improved their comprehension of the text and their retention of the science knowledge. So that act of translating, whether it's across our language or simply rewording the content for another audience, there is a science behind that as a method for reading comprehension and content retention. Related to the research, this live stream question, which I think is a great one, how do you feel this aligns with the science of reading? Do you see a correlation with the sounds first approach to reading instruction that's really heavily adopted in Tennessee?
I don't know if I have an answer for that. Do you feel like you have an answer, Jana?
I will speak to that because the primary investigator for this project is Emily Phillips Galloway at Vanderbilt, and she and I co-authored a paper on the science of reading and broadening our understanding of the science of reading, because not to get too deep into the weeds, but if you think about the science of reading, there's often you see Scarborough's strand. Have you guys ever seen that Scarborough strand, right? And the decoding piece of it is one side and the language is another. This curriculum is targeted for 3rd through 5th grade students, and it's intentionally targeting the language side of it. So you're right, the person who asked this question, there's not a heavy phonics component of this curriculum, and so that's something that would probably need to be supplemented. But what often happens is that language piece of the strand is very under-articulated in terms of how we teach it effectively. We've got all the phonics programs in the world. Language programs, not as many. So this is a science-based language program. Emily Phillips Galloway worked with Paolo Uccelli at Harvard to develop the CALS approach to teaching academic language, and there are CALS components built into this. And they systematically assess and research academic language development. So there are academic language development components built into the curriculum. So yes, it is a science-based approach to reading. No, it's not a sounds first because it's intermediate students and it's addressing the language development side of Scarborough Strand, not the decoding piece. So you would want to supplement it if it were, it's designed really to be used during like the EL pullout time, right? So which the WIDA standards don't necessarily hit as heavily on phonics either. But if you're going to try to use it during like a reading block, you definitely need to beef up the phonics instruction to go with it. Okay, there were other questions in the room though. I had the live stream question, but there were other questions in the room.
I didn't have a question, but I just wanted to let you know what I did with one of my indigenous students who could speak Spanish, but it wasn't his first language. He couldn't write it. I just had him speak into the translation app, either here or on Google Translate, and then he could write it, because then it'll come out in writing, and then he could write it.
So it improved his literacy skills in his first language, probably.
Right. And then, of course, it would translate into English, so he would get all three of them. That was just all I wanted to add.
What a wonderful technology resource to support that literacy development, connecting the words with the text. Great. Other questions about the curriculum or about this idea of using students' languages as a resource, because as a resource that remains largely untapped. Any questions? Yes.
Dr. McLean, can I ask, you just quoted Emily Phillips Galloway in her work, and you said the CALS approach, or I didn't catch what that was.
CALS is the core academic language skills.
So you're saying
C-A-L-S, yes, CALS, C-A-L-S. Core academic language skills is they've identified a set of academic language skills, and then there's an assessment that's paired with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and it's designed for those intermediate levels, like 3rd through 8th grade, as is this curriculum, designed for those kind of intermediate levels.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.